Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also for inviting us and for the translation. And we were saying this morning, I think it's the first time that all the people who worked on Ulrich or read Ulrich come together, and that's a great joy. So thank you very much for that. I hope you understand my English. I have been asked to speak of the gift in the philosophy of Ferdinand Ulrich, especially in Homo Abyssus. In fact, the gift is an ever-present and fundamental light in this book, but paradoxically, it is not a phenomenon that Ulrich considers in its concrete human reality, whether personal or social. The gift will be the great explicit theme of Gabe und Vergebung, Gift and Forgiveness, his last work. In Homo Abyssus, the work which presents the metaphysical heart of Ulrich's thought, there is no phenomenology of the gift. The logic of the gift is rather the implicit logic in which the great questions of metaphysics are clarified and certain difficulties or contradictions resolved. But it is neither a model for thinking nor a total logic or idea that would grasp the totality of the real in its concept. I therefore suggest not to speak directly of the gift, but to make a roundabout tour of what seems to me some of the most fruitful traits in Homo Abyssus, and to develop some of the ideas, distinction, interpretations, which help to think and also, I hope, to live. We shall then see that the gift is, in a way, its central light, and that its important questions are answered on the basis of the consent to the gift or of the refusal of the gift. Therefore, I will first try to ask what Ulrich means when he speaks of being and to present some traits of his ontology. It's maybe ambitious, but we'll try. Then this will lead us to consider the attitude of reason and the fundamental choices it faces, dialectics or gift. Finally, we will look at the status of negativity in Ulrich's thought. Maybe just a remark, also because of a question which came at the end yesterday. I chose in this paper the easiest way, which is to read Ulrich's interpretation of being in a realistic way as created being. I think it corresponds to what Ulrich has in mind when he writes. But the ontology of Homo Abyssus does not necessarily presuppose the light of faith. It can also be grounded in a transcendental reflection on the conditions of possibilities of knowledge, or in a hermeneutic of existence of Dasein. I think probably the following contribution about metaphysics as reenactment will make it clearer. But it is true that Ulrich's ontology becomes much more simple if we leave open the theological horizon it opens itself, an horizon which gives to this ontology its fullness of meaning and frees it also from ambiguities. So my first point, it's a living metaphysics because it refuses the hypostasis of being. One of my professors in Munich had followed the lectures of Ferdinand Ulrich. I believe that he partly owed his philosophical vocation to him. He was a young Jesuit of 19 or 20 years. He had begun his philosophy studies and was beginning to familiarize himself with its concepts, which were for him rather abstract. Being and essence, the real distinction, substance and accident. He told me he learned all of that the way one learns about the rivers of Africa from a geography map. Strange names in an unknown territory that one learns without any impact or clarity in one's life and experience. And then he attended Ferdinand Ulrich's classes, and all of a sudden, these very same concepts became charged with life and meaning, even charged with existential stakes. He found, once again, as he told me, in a very different language and context, what he had discovered during his novitiate as a Jesuit. Philosophy suddenly had something to do with a way of life. It had something to do with existence. Philosophy reveals, interprets, and discerns. This is an essential characteristic of Homo Abyssus and the thinking expressed in it. It is a living metaphysics that avoids the dead ends of ideology or system because this metaphysical thinking takes place on two levels of reality, transcendence, and verification also, personal existence, first of all, and even more fundamentally, the life of God. It is a living metaphysics because it refuses what Ulrich calls the hypostasis of being, which would be the level of a pure logic, as such unable to shed light on concrete existence in its reality and complexity. Ulrich keeps on repeating, quoting Thomas Aquinas, being denotes something complete and simple, yet non-subsistent. To be, or being in itself, is not. Being which subsists in itself is God. But the being of concrete created beings does not subsist. And so when metaphysics as a discourse on being seeks to say something about it, it thus necessarily turns to the existence of what is. But the rigorous refusal to accord whatever reality to be or being in itself, even as an object of thought, nevertheless does not lead Ulrich to a radical critique of metaphysics. In fact, we can speak of being in ontological difference with what is. It speaks of existence as a fact and in its concrete reality. It is also the name of the principle of unity and diversity of beings, the principle of the singularity of all that is. Being is the unity of creation, of reality, and its mobility, its fecundity, and its life. Being is that which grounds the possibility of the word, logos, and of meaning. Being denotes something non-subsistent, but also complete and simple, it was said by Aquinas. And as such, the first of created things, according to the expression of St. Thomas again, taken over by Ulrich. Being, however, is not a thing. This expression, ambiguous perhaps, designates the first fundamental position of reality created in the difference of the Creator. And on the side of God, it designates the fundamental will of the existence of the world. Being is thus one with the creative act, or one could rather say that it is the presence of this act in what is. The being of the created beings is not God. Neither is it the ontological hinge? Okay, thank you. That would link the world and the absolute, a conception that Ulrich criticizes under the term ontotheological. The being of created things is itself created. This maintains God's transcendence and opens up the possibility of a relationship. But this being is pure mediation, Ulrich says. Being thus does not cover up, but affirms that which is. It signifies the affirmation and the goodness of what is. That being is the first of created things, and pure mediation also means the unity of the creative act, and therefore the unity in creation, a unity that the affirmation of the singularity of each thing does not destroy. Finally, being as first of created things expresses the gift of the totality of being, and therefore also the possibility of evolution from the immanent possibilities of creation. Here especially the light of the gift enlightens. The creative act is not possession of being, but gift of being. Being is really given, and this gift is fruitful. If being is the first of created things, Ulrich immediately stresses that it is not totally marked by the effect character, and is not immediately recognizable as such. There is here, I think, an original idea of Homo Abyssus, what Ulrich calls the unclosed character of being as being. It's worse in German, das Gepräge des Nicht-Verursachtseins des Seins als Sein. Okay, so the unclosed character of being as being. What does he mean by that? He actually takes again an affirmation of St. Thomas and deploys its existential meaning. Yet, we can ask for the cause of all beings we encounter. But, quote of Thomas Aquinas, To be caused does not enter into the essence of being as such, Aquinas tells us, and Ulrich with him. On the contrary, all that is as it is bears the mark or the imprint of the uncaused character of being. The being or the to be of created entities is not God's being. This is what the affirmation of created being as the first of the created things preserves, but it bears the mark of an uncaused origin, because being does not mean in itself being caused. The uncaused character of being, qua being, prevents us from seeing the whole reality only as an effect. Creation is, and as such, does not immediately refer to its cause. For Ulrich, it is paradoxically the great truth reminded of by atheism. The possibility of atheism rests for him on the completeness of creation, and yet this completeness, apparent absence of the creator, shows the dignity of creation, manifests the seriousness of the gift, we might say, and therefore reveals the creator to whom the creation in its substantiality resembles. And so, while manifesting the radicality of the gift, the possibility of atheism can paradoxically reveal the creator more deeply and more truly. Ulrich writes, it's a quite long quote, "This unique character of the being of the world, having closure in itself, from which the hidden God has apparently withdrawn himself, the world that always presents itself to all of our questioning as a world that persists in self-sameness, the world that engulfs all the bridges to the infinite that we erect in an attempt to bring God closer to us, that is, to capture him as a piece of the world. It is this world, precisely in its tempting man to alienate himself from God because of its apparent absoluteness, that reveals the depths of the uncaused character of being qua being. This character is the ultimate seal of God's creative, loving intimacy." End quote. Each being, as it is, bears the mark and the likeness of the uncaused origin, and this character is precisely in each being what is original, incommunicable, irreducible. It is what characterizes, in particular, of course, the person, who is substance in the full sense of the word. In this place, we cannot but think of the first catechesis of the theology of the body, where John Paul II interprets the solitude of Adam as a mark of the likeness of God, as revelation of his own personal existence, and as a vocation to be interlocutor of the Absolute. I think that Ulrich's Metaphysics helps us to think this in a rigorous way. Since the world in its substantiality and each thing in its substantiality bears this imprint of the uncaused character of being, the concrete can therefore never be reduced to being only a result, the result of the application of a logic of a program. It is not reproducible. It bears a seal of absoluteness by its uniqueness and substantiality, a seal of mystery and of fruitfulness. These characters of what is, no logic can produce them dialectically. Speculative reason cannot produce these characteristics because they are by definition original. Concrete beings bear this character. Dialectics tries to reproduce it. One could even say that this character constitutes the horizon of the dialectic, but an horizon that always escapes, and in which only the humble reason that listens to being is already in via. With this, I'm coming to the second point, the attitude of reason and the choice it faces, dialectics or gift. In order to be sure of itself and truly master its object, reason can feel itself to be responsible for reconstructing the totality of reality in a speculative process. Thus, it finds itself before the enormous responsibility of starting from scratch, of recreating everything by the sheer force of the dialectic without ever recovering the original force of being and its unclosed character. This dialectical reason must make itself the agent of the ontological difference. If it starts from reality seen as pure facticity, it must then deny this facticity, which is not transparent to being, in order to recover the dimension of being that unifies reality, which is the place of logos. But the negation of the concrete makes dialectical reason posit being, even if it is only for the moment of a reflection's determination in the process of thinking, says Ulrich. So makes posit being as something that is, which is what Ulrich calls the hypostasis of being. Reason then immediately negates this hypostasis once more to assure the subsistence of the concrete reality by this negation. Reason, thus, finds itself obliged to make itself, as Ulrich says, the executor of the contradiction. In contrast to this dialectical reason that wants or believes itself obliged to grasp the totality of being in its concept, Ulrich describes a reason open to being, obedient to the sense of being, as he says. This reason, accepting the fact that being is not, and that it can neither take hold of it directly, consents that the concrete beginning of thought be always the subsistence of the concrete being. It does not renounce the boldness of speculative thinking, which seeks to speak of being. Daring the question of being precisely translates the German subtitle of Homo Abyssus, das Wagnis der Seinsfrage, daring the question of being. In a speculative, that is to say reflexive movement, reason, which is open to the sense of being that is manifested in the concrete reality, discovers being as pure mediation. The ontological difference is open in the concrete reality to the reason that accepts the little way of the journey among the concrete beings without reducing them to their pure facticity. Identity and difference can be thought together, because diversity does not imply the negation of a unity first posited artificially as rigid. This rigid identity would correspond to the hypostasis of being, the negation of which would break the reality into unrelated entities, fragments of factical reality, says Ulrich, absolute particularism. Likewise, the essence or form does not get lost in the materiality of being, because the essence does not need to cling to itself in the ideality of a definition. Or rather, we don't need to think essence like that. Identity does not have to preserve itself from dispersion in historicity and so on. Being, which is the foundation of reason, but a foundation which it cannot grasp reflexively and master in an absolute logic, is manifested to it as pure mediation and principle of fruitfulness, mediation between identity and difference, essence and accidents, and so on. In Gabe und Vergebung, Ulrich describes a scene between a child and his mother, which can illustrate the listening obedience to being we are talking about here in an interpersonal context. It will recall us to what we have heard yesterday. If I would have known, I would have chosen another example, but it's like it is. So he took that from a German psychologist. I forgot his name. Maybe we must say that Ulrich first taught in School for Education at the University of Regensburg, and maybe that's why there are many texts about education, about childhood, about. Okay. So I quote, it's rather long, but it might rest as if the things before were rather abstract. We see a little child playing with blocks. He is on all fours. By assembling the blocks, sometimes slowly, as reflecting, sometimes quickly, trying and starting again, he forgets himself and is completely dedicated to his play. In a certain sense, the becoming of the work is the language of its own becoming. The place of the child's action is thus both outside and inside him, all the more outside, in the thing itself, that the child is engaged in his play. And the child is all the more present to himself in a living interiority that he is dedicated to what he does, that he forgets himself. Gradually the tower takes shape. Finally the child calls out, as if the last attention to the work completed in his playing was at the same time the diversion of the it, the thing, to turn to the thou. Look, Mom, a tower. The mother turns to the child and its construction and says, yes, a tower. It is beautiful, so high, and it has a gate too. You can even pass it with a big carriage. And who is up there, looking out the window? Ulrich asks, is not the behavior of the mother strange at first sight? The mother refers to the child who built the tower, and yet she does not say a word of the builder of the tower. She does not congratulate him or things like that. In a sense, she turns her gaze away from him to the thing, to what it's all about. She forgets, so to speak, the creative origin of the work, and she has the work itself before her eyes, the work considered for itself. And yet, she looks at the tower with the eyes of the playing child. Had not he forgotten himself while building? And at this moment, the mother lovingly does the same with him. Ulrich continues, does this mean that the child is of no importance to the mother? In no case, since in turning completely towards the work, the mother accomplishes with the playing child his exit out of himself, being dedicated to the thing. She is with the child in the place where the genitive work of the child became visible and concrete. Through the contemplation of the work, in an act of creative reenactment, she accomplishes the child's self-forgetfulness, his commitment to the work. She is present to the child in himself, the child whose inner objective fruitfulness is revealed in the work, but is not identical to the production of the work. The mother's attention is a living and concrete yes to what comes from the child and bears the traces of its origin. End quote. We see here that there is no opposition between the interpersonal relationship and the material realm of things, nor between the realm of being and the realm of doing. The child is given and forgotten in his action, and the attitude of the mother is the one that is most adjusted to the person of the child. She reaches out to the being of the child by accomplishing with him that movement by which he goes out of himself, right, while remaining in himself, he realizes his being in his action. This movement is described by Ulrich with the verb entäußern, the child emptied himself. The reference to the movement of the incarnation is obvious. In the preface of Homo Abyssus, Ulrich writes, the subject matter itself has transcended ontology into anthropology and anthropology into Christology, and I have followed in the wake of this movement. Ontology is transcended into anthropology because it is above all, that's not the quote anymore. So ontology is transcended in anthropology because it is above all in the person and its concrete existence that the interpretation of being is done and decided. And ontology and anthropology are transcended in Christology because it is in the light of the incarnation of the Son that the sense of being as pure mediation is finally revealed. The Son who, being in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself, and for this God raised him high and gave him the name which is above all other names. Mystery of glory and poverty, says Ulrich. We find this motive of the hymn to the Philippians implicitly present in many pages of Homo Abyssus. The pure mediation of being is another name for the ipseity of annihilation and glorification, for the to be of the substance in and by the radical gift of itself, in the otherness of matter, of the accidental. I'm now coming to my last part. This kenotical motive is well known to idealism. One could read it in a dialectical way, seeing in it a constitutivity of the negation or even of the contradiction in being. This invites us to clarify the place of the negative. This is one of the crucial points of Homo Abyssus, on which Ulrich discusses closely, not only with Hegel and Heidegger, but also with Sievert. Mr. Torp will probably speak about the relationship between Ulrich and Sievert. In an ontological context, we can speak of negativity to signify several things. Negativity can mean the constitutive finitude of beings, not to be infinite or absolute, which is not to be conceived as an external limitation, but as an intrinsic definition, a positive determination of finite being. Negativity can also express the transcendence of man, capable of the mystery of being, as Heidegger says, the responsibility for being that is its essence. We find this in Ulrich too. It even explains the title, Homo Abyssus. Finally, there is also negativity, or at least negation, in the non-subsistence of being itself, which Ulrich affirms now and again, recognizing as such, and only as such, its convertibility with nothingness. And yet, for Ulrich, and this is an essential point, the negative is not constitutive of being. Non-being is not a moment of to be. It would include potentiality in its pure actuality. Being would no longer be pure mediation. Composed of act and potency, it would be a being, it would be a kind of hypostasis, the one that Ulrich has constantly denounced. This hypostasis, which the negation of negation should destroy, would render impossible the original manifestation of being in the positivity of the singular existence and in the convertibility of the transcendentals. This hypostasis would also constitute a conceptual or ideal in-between between God and the world, and this concept, unifying being and not being, would constitute the true principle, a place of pure indetermination, from which only the negation of the negative would release, either toward the positivity of the determination of finite beings, or toward the absolute positivity of the ipsum esse subsistence. This bad ontotheology, which is necessarily implied if one accepts the constitutivity of the negative for being, relativizes both the createdness of the finite and the transcendence of God. What liberates from this dialectical ontotheology is the humility of reason, which recognizes the determination of the concretedness of what is. But in the end, it is only the sublation, the movement of transcending that suppresses and keeps at once, the sublation of the gift of being in the actuality of the Trinitarian life, whose source is the gift of the Father, which can really preserve the pure mediation of being. It is not a theological presupposition for Ulrich, but a philosophical necessity. For Ulrich, the force that moves the gigantic speculative effort of modern thought, and of idealism in particular, is in fact the search for this powerful positivity of the principle, a power of giving that idealism tries to let emerge speculatively. In Homo Abyssus, Ulrich goes so far as to say that modern metaphysics is thus in reality a struggle for the Father, a struggle for the potentia generandi patris, who is in person, the mediation between nature and person, the absolute gift of the divine nature to the Son in the Spirit, the mystery of an eternally fruitful, free, and personal origin, an origin that is source and power of all mediation. The negative is not in the principle for Ulrich, and yet existential negativity, that is, incompleteness of all kinds, possibilities of refusal, finitude, vulnerability, and death, this existential negativity has a very important place in his work. But even this existential negativity may be illuminated by the light of the gift. Its hermeneutical place could be situated in an essential characteristic of the gift, which Ulrich expresses with the German word we heard yesterday, which is quite difficult to translate, umsonst, meaning for nothing free of charge, but also for nothing in vain. A gift may not bear fruit. The one who really gives, or who gives himself really, takes the risk of having given in vain, of having lost himself in vain. In this regard, the gift is beyond logic. But only at this price is there a gift, and that's what actually makes it fruitful. And so, the experience of meaninglessness that opposes an easy finalism, the experience of being able to lose oneself in vain, the experience of many kinds of death, which seems sterile, even the completeness of the world of which we spoke and which seems to reject the question why, all those are experiences of the for nothing in vain of the gift of being. But this for nothing can also be a sign and seal of the gratuitousness and radicality of the gift, and at the heart of the negative appears then an absolute liberality in the principle. The umsonst for nothing of the gift is thus the place where the negative is saved. Negativity is assumed in the gratuitousness of love from the beginning, without being in any way neutralized or relativized. In the reality of the world, in the history of the world, it is on the cross that the identity between gift in vain and gratuitous love is assumed in the flesh, and that all negativity is saved in this act of free love that embraces all creation in the history of man. And so, saving being from indetermination by the power of the negative, or conceiving being in the light of the radical gift, the consequences of this ontological choice on the way we think the world thinks and on the direction of our action are immense. A few words to conclude. The ontology of Homo Abyssus is open to the drama of sin and illuminates it. It presents itself as ontodramatic. This book is indeed the fruit of a kind of intuition. It was written within a few weeks only, certainly from the inner place of the drama in question. We feel it in the vocabulary. The book is marked by the engagement in a fight. The ontological interpretations have an existential scope in which the whole being is engaged and decided. For each question, Ulrich takes always his reader to the heart of the crisis where the existence is decided in the consent or refusal of the sense of being. Homo Abyssus is thus an ontology that discerns and makes able to discern. A drama and a crisis, the expression of which is sometimes violent, and yet we discover at the heart of this drama the presence of the original gift where the crisis is already decided. And this is above all what Homo Abyssus brings, the epiphany of a gift, original and free, which has the power to assume any refusal, which is the foundation of our being and the source of our hope. In the book The Name of God is Mercy, Pope Francis speaks of an old woman met in Buenos Aires who told him, if the Lord did not forgive everything, the world would not exist. She expressed, in fact, the metaphysical intuition that the actuality of being is forgiveness. And in the end, it seems to me that this is what Ulrich's ontology allows us to think. Thank you for your attention.